Hey, what's up you guys, Jackjackhd here. So today, I'm going to be showing you guys how to build a background change button for your Fortnite creative maps. Now before we get started, be sure to leave a like on this video. Hopefully you guys enjoy this video and find it helpful. Subscribe if you're new and you're interested in these types of videos or just videos from me. Use code JackJackhd in the item shop if you do want to support me, greatly appreciated. These videos take some effort, take some time for me to produce, so I greatly appreciate the support. Let's get right into it. Alright, so I am here on a new island. Alright, first things first, I'm gonna go to my island. You don't have to do this, but this is just what I do when I start making things on a map. I set time of day to 4 p.m. and it stays daytime. Alright, so first things first, I suggest you go into the corner of the map. You want to hide these devices. You don't want people to see these devices. We're gonna go into my island, slide over to creative, and in devices, we are gonna go and find the barriers. So here are the barriers. Alright, so I'm going to place down 5 barriers right next to each other like so. You can always add more barriers, but just for example, for this video, I'm going to have 5. We're going to go into the settings. We're going to change a few settings. This is probably the most fun thing. First one, barrier style. We're going to set this to whatever you want. You can decide what style you want. I'm going to change it to sky blue like so. So go through all the barriers and set a barrier style. Thread plate. We're going to use the normal nebula, Starfield red. There we go. Alright, so now that you have the style set, we're going to go back into all the settings. We're going to change a few more settings. Enable during game phase, we're going to set this to none. So when the game does start, the barrier is disabled. Alright, so go through all the barriers, enable during game phase, make sure it is on none. Alright. So if you do start the game and one of the barriers are enabled, if you do see one of the barriers, it means that you don't have the settings for that barrier. Enable during phase, turn to none. So make sure enable during phase is set to none. Next, what we're going to do is go into settings once again. Enabled when receiving from, we're going to set the first barrier to channel 11. Disable when receiving from, we're going to set this to 21. All right, so what we're doing, we're setting up the barrier channels. We're going to have a enable and we're going to have a disable. So these two channels here will be the activate and the disable for this barrier. All right, that is confirmed. We're going to go to the next barrier. Same thing. We're going to change the settings, but we're going to bump it up by 1. So enable when receiving from, this will be set to channel 12. Disable when receiving from, this will be 22 instead of 21. There you go. Channel. Next barrier. Same thing. We're going to change the settings and only add it by 1 point. Enable when receiving from, channel 13. Disable when receiving from, set the channel 23. Rinse and repeat, this will be 14. Last one, this will be 15. Disable when receiving from, this will be 25. There you go. Alright, so very important, make sure all the settings, all the channels are correct, exactly how I did it. If you messed up one of the channels, you will run into issues. So make sure all those channels are changed correctly. Alright, so next we're going to go back to devices. We're going to select the trigger. Go ahead and place it. We're going to place one in front of the first barrier. Alright, so in the settings for this trigger, we're going to go all the way to the very bottom. The only settings we're going to change is one trigger transmit on. We're going to set this to 11. So if you remember, channel 11 is actually the enable for this barrier, channel 11. So this trigger here will activate that barrier. Alright, so next what we're going to do is duplicate this trigger. So this trigger here, we're going to change the settings and we're going to turn this into a disable trigger for that barrier. One trigger transmit, this will be set to 21. Alright, so if you remember, go back into the barrier settings. We have disable when receiving from. We have this set to channel 21. We have the enable trigger right here that activates the barrier. We also have the disable trigger that disables the barrier. Alright, so next what we do is do the exact same thing with all the other barriers. But what we're going to do is actually duplicate these triggers. Like so. And we're just going to change the settings. So, back in the barrier here, at the very bottom, enable when receiving from, channel 12, disable when receiving from, channel 22. So this here, the first trigger, all we do is bump it up by 1. This will be channel 12. Next trigger, bump it up by 1, channel 22. Copy. Bump it up by 1, this will be 13. 23. If you want to copy multiple things at once, all you do is click on the right on the D-pad and it highlights green like so. Then you copy it. Just a little tip for you. Same thing, changing the settings, bump it up by 1, 14, 24. Last one, this will be channel 15 and channel 25. Alright, so again, make sure all the settings for your triggers are correct. All it takes is one setting to be wrong, and then your map won't work, and then you'll run into issues. So make sure you double check, make sure all the settings are correct. Go back to devices. We're going to go and select the sequencer. We're going to need 5 sequencers. We're going to go ahead and place it in the angle that I have it, like so. We're going to go into the settings for the first sequencer. All we're going to do is change the settings here, length to normal. It reduces the size of the sequencer. Go ahead and continue with the sequencers. Add the length back to normal, like so. And there you go. So all the sequencers have been placed. We're going to go into the settings of all the sequencers and change the channels on them. Start when receiving from. This will be set to 1. So what we're doing right now is setting the channel for the sequencer to activate. Go through all the different sequencers. Start sequence when receiving from. This will be set to channel 2 instead of 1. Start sequencer. Channel 3. Channel 4. Then last one, channel 5. So that was channels 1 to 5. Every single sequencer has its own channel. Alright, so next what we're going to do is a little bit complicated, but try to follow what I'm doing here. Alright, so as you can see here, we got 5 rows. We got 1 row for every single barrier. Alright, so once again, we have these 2 triggers here next to the barrier behind it. These 2 barriers have a function for that barrier. This trigger here activates the barrier, and this trigger here disables that barrier. So we're going to take this first trigger, which activates that barrier, and we're going to place it into the sequencer. Next, what we're going to do is go to the very last barrier trigger, and we're going to take the disable trigger and place it into the first sequencer, like so. So to explain to you what happens, and when the sequencer goes off, it activates whatever is inside it. So the triggers that we have in this first sequencer is the activate for that barrier over there. Also, we have the disable for the previous barrier, and the previous barrier will actually be the last one because it'll cycle around. Next, we're going to go and set up the next barrier. Take the activate for that second barrier, place it into the sequencer. But instead of taking it from the last barrier from last time, we are going to take the disable for the first barrier, which is this one here, and then we're going to place it into the sequencer. Alright, so that's set up. Next barrier, we're going to take the activate trigger, place it into its sequencer, and then we're going to take the disable from its previous barrier, which is this one, and place it into the sequencer. Same thing, this is the 4th barrier. We're going to take the activate for that barrier, place it into the sequencer, take the disable for the previous barrier, then place it into the sequencer. Last one, take the activate for the last barrier, take the disable from its previous barrier, and place it into the sequencer. Alright, there you go. That is set up. Now make sure you're doing that correctly. Try to understand what I'm trying to do here. Anytime the sequencer goes off, it activates a new barrier, but also disables the previous barrier that was active. So for example, if the first barrier was active and was showing, when I click on the button a second time, it activates the next barrier, but also disables the previous barrier. So hopefully you guys understand that. It's a lot easier when you understand what you're doing on Fortnite Creative, and also you have a better chance of not running into issues. Next, what we're going to do is place down a sequencer just back here. We're going to make this a little bit smaller, so we're going to go to length. We're going to set this to 2. We are going to also change start sequence when receiving from. We're going to set this to 100. We're going to have this connected with the button. All right, next we're going to go into devices. We are going to select another trigger. I'm going to hold on Y so I place it right away. So we're going to place this trigger inside this new sequencer. here are the settings that we're going to change. We're going to set delay to 1 second. Next settings, enable when receiving from. We're going to set this to 5. Disable when receiving from. We're going to set this to 1. Last option, one trigger transmit on. This will be set to 1. All right, confirm. Take the first trigger. We're going to copy it. Go into the settings. All right, so very, very important. The settings that we're going to change. Enabled on game start. We're going to disable this. So it's disabled when the game starts. All right, so we're going to go to the channels here. We're going to change the channels. Enable when receiving from. This will be set to 1. So it's set to channel 1. So once the first trigger is active, this gets enabled. Then the next time someone clicks on the button, this trigger will activate. Disable when receiving from. This will be set to 2. So it gets disabled once it activates. Last option, one trigger transmit the channel 2. All right, so next we're going to continue. We're going to duplicate this once again. Enable when receiving from. We're just going to bump it up by 1. So channel 2. Disable when receiving from. This will be set to 3. We're just going to bump all these channels. One trigger transmit on channel 3. All right, copy. We're going to do the exact same thing. Add 1 point to these channels that have been changed. Enable when receiving from channel 3. Disable when receiving from channel 4. One trigger transmit on channel 4. All right, last trigger. We're going to have 5 triggers. Enable when receiving from channel 4. Disable when receiving from channel 5. One trigger transmit channel 5. There you go. 5 triggers for all 5 sequencers back here. If you remember, all the sequencers start from 1 to 5, and now the triggers here get activated, and they also have channels set from 1 to 5. All right, so next, 2 devices. We are gonna have the button here. We're gonna place down a button. The button's kind of tiny, it's puny. So we're gonna make it a little bit bigger. I'm gonna resize it. Settings are on the left side of the screen. You can always try to learn it yourself. So there you go. We have a decent sized button here. What we do is go into the settings for this button. The settings we're gonna change is reset delay. I have reset delay on so people don't spam this button. We're gonna set this to 2 seconds. Last option, one interacted with. We're gonna set this to channel 100. So this button here is connected with this sequencer. Sequencer gets activated by that button. Once the sequencer goes off, it activates the first trigger, which is this. First trigger activates this sequencer back here, and then activates the first barrier, but also disables its previous barrier. All right, so it's time for us to test it out. Here we go. This is the test. There you go. Then recycles, restarts. Now if you have everything working, that's awesome. If you don't have your map working, if the function isn't working, it just means that your settings is incorrect, 100% incorrect, and you just got to go through the video again and make sure all the channels are correct. Don't skip any part on the video. Very, very important. It's happened many times when people would say the map doesn't work, the video doesn't work. It just means that your settings for the devices was incorrect and you didn't fully follow through with the video. All right, so for the people that have their barriers changing and activating and disabling correctly, I'm gonna make a large scale barrier around the map just to show you guys how that's done. So we're gonna go into the middle of the map like so. Or in this case, in the middle of my 1v1 arena, I'm gonna go underneath the map. So if I hold down the left analog stick, I can phase or even glow, and I can phase through the floor. Make sure that you have floors above the ground like so. So I have floors just here. What we're going to do is take a wall that's above the ground. In this case, I have the stuff here, and then I'm going to face through the floor, and then I can place things underneath the map like so. I'm going to take a floor and place it down here. All right, so down here, I'm going to go ahead and place down these floors once again. Make a type of like platform. All right, so what we're gonna do is now go to devices. We are gonna select 5 barriers. For our button, we have 5 barriers set. So we're gonna take the same barrier styles and then have it on the barriers down here. We're gonna take these barriers, place it on the platforms down here, like so. So the first barrier that is set, we're gonna do the exact same settings as we had above ground. All right, so we have 5 barriers set here. We don't have to use the same styles. but we do need the same channels for every single barrier. So if you look through the first barrier, we have enable when receiving from set to channel 11, and disable when receiving from we have this set to 21. All right, so here's my first barrier. We're gonna change the settings here. Enable during game phase, make sure it's on disable. Very important option, zone shape, have this set to box hollow, so you can actually be inside the barrier. If you have it set to box, you'll have a lot of issues. Make sure you have it set to box hollow. So enable when receiving from, this is the first barrier, so this will be set to channel 11. Disable when receiving from, this will be set to channel 21. All right, so that is set. We're gonna go to the second barrier. Change the same options. Enabled during game phase, set it to none. Zone shape, set it to box hollow. Enabled when receiving from, this will be set to 12 because it is a second barrier. Disable when receiving from, 22. All right, third barrier. Box hollow. Enable during game phase, none. Enable when receiving from, set it to 13. Disable when receiving from, 23. Fourth barrier, enable during phase, none. Zone shape, box hollow. Enable when receiving from, 14. Disable when receiving from, 24. Last one, same options that have to be changed. Enable during phase, none. Zone shape, box hollow. Enable when receiving from, 15. Disable when receiving from, 25. All right, so here are the last settings you have to change for the barriers. Back into the first barrier. Barrier width, I'm gonna set this to 50 or 60. I'm gonna set it to probably 50. And barrier width, I'm gonna set it to 50 as well. Barrier height is all up to preference. You can decide what you want. Barrier height, I'm gonna set this to 100. So right now we are designing the size of the barrier. Barrier width, barrier depth, and barrier height, these are just preference. You can use whatever size you want for your barriers. So we're going to change the same settings for every single barrier. All right, that is set. The final option, I almost forgot, the final options that will change for the barriers is the barrier style. First one, sky blue. Second one, red force field, thread plate, nebula. And the last barrier style, we had it set to starfield red. So the game hasn't started yet, and what you actually see is just this weird like matrix type of thing. Next, what I'm gonna do is set up the button, have it next to the 1v1. All right, game start. So it looks a lot different from when the game hasn't started. You can actually see that the barriers are disabled. If you do see the barriers when the game does start, it just means that your settings is incorrect. Here is the button to change the background. And there you go. Background has changed. All the different background colors that we have. There's a red force field. There's a plate, thread plate. There is a galaxy. And there is the starfield red, which isn't that popular, I don't think. It should cycle again. There you go. So there you go, guys. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. Once again, it's a lot easier if you understand what all the devices do. I tried my best to explain to you guys how the devices work and what they do. Again, if your map doesn't work, it just means that your settings is incorrect. The tutorial works, it's just your settings are incorrect. Make sure you look through all the devices, make sure all the channels are correct. Channels are very important. All right, so making this button is a little bit like in the intermediate level in Fortnite Creative. So let me know in the comments down below if you got your button working. Hopefully you guys enjoy this video. Be sure to leave a like on this video if you enjoyed detailed explanation videos just like this. Subscribe if you're new and you're interested in watching videos from me. Use code Jackjackhd in the item shop if you want to support me. Greatly appreciate it if you do support me. My next video will actually show you guys how to use the same function, but instead of it being a button, it'll actually be separate barriers that you can pickaxe or shoot so that the barrier changes. So stay tuned for that. And yeah, you guys, I'll see you guys next time. Take it easy, guys. Peace.